Invisible running stitches are typically the last seam or the last few seams of your project. What you'll want to start with doing is folding on this seam allowance. When you fold it over and you look at the other side, you should not be able to see the markings. This is paper. When you have actual fabric, you just won't be able to fold like this. You'll have to actually iron it. But this makes it easy to practice. You want to turn right sides out. So our task is to sew these two edges together without flipping it over, because typically this is going to be the last seam of our project. So it'll be after you've already turned it right side out and you're just going to be stitching that final part together. As per usual, we're going to start with threading our needle and tying a knot at the end. Start by piercing A0 through the back side. Like this. Now, make sure that you're only piercing right next to that blue dot and not actually on it. Once you've pierced A0, pull it all the way through. Now, I just wanted to mention that if you are sewing an invisible running stitch, it is most likely that your edge is not A, because typically this is not the first stitch that you sew. Ladder stitches are again at the very end. So it's more likely that this is stitch C or D or even Z or A, F or something like that. Just keep that in mind. The process is the same for any lettered edge. Okay. Once you are done pulling your thread through A0 on the first side, you pierce A0 on the other edge. Don't stab your own finger. Use a thimble if you're a beginner to protect your fingers. Okay. So. Okay, so once you've pierced both A0s or B0s or whatever edge you're on, once you've pierced both of the zeros, tug on your thread a little bit to draw the edges together. Once you've pierced both A0s, or if you're working on edge B, B0s, or edge C, C0s, once you've pierced both of the zeros together, just tug on the thread a bit to draw the two edges together. Then, take your needle and pierce the dot right after A0 on the same edge that you just pierced. So bring it back up through here. Then give it a bit of a tug to remove any tangles. After you've brought it back up on the dot right after A0, on this edge you do the same. You pierce the dot right after A0 on this side as well, because you always pierce corresponding dots to sew them together. Once you've done that, pull it through to draw the two edges together. After you do that, you bring the needle back up through this edge on the dot halfway between A0 and A1. And then again, you pierce it on the dot halfway between A0 and A1 on the other edge. Now, it's okay if you leave it a little bit loose, because what you'll periodically do is kind of tug it to keep drawing the edges together, but to actually manipulate it, it is helpful to have the edges sitting apart a bit. So continuing this pattern, you can start to see why they call it a ladder stitch, because you make stitches by jumping across the seam allowances by connecting the dots with thread from the outside to form these rungs of your ladder, and then you pull on the rungs, or you pull on the thread to tighten the rungs to really just draw the seam together like this. But yeah, you keep going until you have rungs all the way down, and then you tie it off. So after you're done stitching this pattern up until the last dot, which is A7 in this example, bring it back up through the previous dot to make a tailor's knot. You just bring it through the front and really just tie a knot using the stitch. Give it a gentle tug. You can go back and do one more if you'd like to make sure that it's extra secure. Here we have a tailor's knot to finish off our invisible running stitch. So I just wanted to clarify why I call this an invisible running stitch instead of, say, a ladder stitch or a slip stitch or whatever. I call it an invisible running stitch because if you flip it over, it is actually like literally the exact equivalent of your typical running stitch, which I go over in one of the other videos. The reason why people separate ladder stitch and running stitch, even though they're literally the same thing, is that they're used under different circumstances. You use an invisible running stitch when you do not have easy access to the back side of what you're sewing. It's usually your final seam or your final few seams where you have it turned right side out, and you are just kind of closing it up and you can't really like reach inside of your garment to stitch it the way you normally could. So invisible stitches are basically the ones where you have to kind of do the same stitch but like from a forward position with the right side of the fabric facing you, and you're kind of like blind in your movements. Whereas the running stitch, even though the outcome is the exact same thing, you just kind of like hold it differently because you're earlier in your project and you have more freedom to like manipulate it and handle it from the back side. So I'm pretty sure most stitches can be done from this position or this position, so every stitch has an invisible version and a just regular version. So this is a running stitch, and then what we just did, the way we just did it, is an invisible running stitch. You can also do an invisible back stitch, an invisible zigzag stitch. I won't go over that for some time, but just know that stitches can be done from all sorts of positions,